There we go. Now we're live. Hi, and welcome everybody to the Apimondia 2025 recap on global beekeeping trends and our webinar. You can see a few of the pictures already from the background is a replay of the last few days that we spent in Copenhagen, Denmark. With me here today is Dr. James Wilkes, our founder and chief beekeeping officer, and my name is Max Wenzel. I'm the co-founder and CEO. Together, we spent a few days in Copenhagen last week. And before we dive into the full-on recap, I'm going to pass it on over to James to talk a little bit about the fall prep, just key things to keep on the radar. Then we will talk about Apimondia, the Apimondia recap, just highlights from the world's biggest beekeeping congress. 7,500 beekeepers made it out to Copenhagen, Denmark over the last week. And it was a lot of fun, and it was great. We learned a lot, and we're happy to talk about it. And then James will recap a little bit of his talk that he gave on honey authentication. With that, James, over to you.
All right, thanks, Max. And although we're doing the recap of Apimondia, we don't want to jump over our own bees and what we should be doing right now. And so I just wanted to give you a quick, look at the what you should be thinking about right now. Again, this is Northern Hemisphere and varies depending on how north you are. But of course, this time of year we are full on in winter mode, looking towards how our bees are going to make it through winter, making sure they have what they need. And so this time of year, you're pretty much just monitoring the hive health. To me, the things you're looking for this time of year are a strong population, good food stores, and good space. So you should be getting them into their final configuration. And as many people kind of advise for this time of year, take your losses now is a way of saying that, in that you don't want to necessarily take weak colonies into winter and combine or do other things to, again, just get your hives in the best state possible to make it through the winter. Um, may need some feeding this time of year as well, generally sugar syrup, or maybe even redistributing stores. If one hive has more stores than you think they'll need, you can share those with others. And pollen, it depends. At least in my area here in North Carolina, pollen is usually in excess this time of year. In fact, you can also get pollen bound. You can get too much pollen this time of year. But that's something you want to check as well. And then for Varroa, you definitely should probably already have done most of the things you're going to do for Varroa. Anything you're doing now is just monitoring to make sure those interventions worked. Maybe doing a follow-up treatment as well, depending on if you're still having heavy loads. But again, it's pretty late to be doing much management of the Varroa. And so I've just got a few pictures here. This was right before I left to go to Copenhagen. Goldenrod was full on. Asters since I left. The purple ones, those have come out. Bees are working those pretty heavily. The picture on the right, that's a pretty nice looking population for that colony, and I was very happy with that. So that's what you want to see, is just a good number of bees. They're also transitioning, getting ready to go to winter bees, and I'll just say sometimes in the fall, inspecting your bees can be a little unsettling if they're in this transition. Even the brood nest might look a little disorganized, things like that. They're moving into this winter state, and sometimes it just looks a little odd. I'll just say that if you're inexperienced, your bees in the fall are going to look very different than they do other times of the year. So, Max, on the next one, I think, this is I don't stick with one way of feeding or doing anything really, but in this case, I've got a hive top feeder. You can see on the left there, on the right, this in hive feeder. A good number of our hives in our area need feed this fall. We had a very poor nectar flows pretty much all summer long. Everybody was kind of struggling on the edge. for the whole summer, and that so they need some fattening up for the winter, and so we're having to do a good bit of feeding sugar syrup here in our area. Next slide, Max. This is kind of the space thought, and the one on the left. This is kind of a bigger configuration for me. I generally run single deeps. So you can see on the right, those three hives, all those are single deeps. They're going to stay in that configuration. The one on the left, it's got an extra super plus a hive top feeder, and that was just because it needed more space. There were more bees, and they were already laying brood in that top for, super. And then next one's Max. So these pictures I wanted to share. This is post formic acid or formic pro treatment, and these are very nice, clean looking brood patterns. After after the treatment, and if you've used formic, it's a pretty harsh treatment, and the queen will sometimes shift her laying around, but once she gets laying back, this is what you want to see, just nice solid brood patterns. And so that I was very pleased with that. And in your fall hives, again, you want to kind of monitor and make sure that the queen is laying well, that you got that good population getting ready going into the winter for those winter bees, which is why we, emphasized 2 months ago, making sure you get it cleaned up. All right. I think that's it, Max, for
Yeah,
our.
I have one actually. David is the role model here. He's already putting questions in the chat. So first off,
Yeah.
he's one point that he said for anyone with hearing difficulties, live captions on Zoom are reasonable accurate. They may even give you my fine German accent in the captions if they do. Let's see if that works out. He also mentioned with one comment. Today I rotated the hive entrances to reduce access, removed queen excluders, and put fondant on those hives that needed feeding. General rule, I don't use syrup except in an emergency. Do you want to comment on that, James?
No, I mean there's clearly different philosophies of feeding, and especially in the fall going into winter, you're kind of going to transition. There's certainly a time when the liquid feed works better, and then when you want to transition to the more, if you're going to continue to feed, something like fondant is better in the winter time. So for sure.
Sure. Well, awesome. Well, thanks for the recap on that, James. And with that, I would say let's dive right into what happened in Copenhagen over the last few days. And if you want to start a little bit by just talking about what maybe most impressed you or what excited you, you can see here in the background. This is James and myself presenting our poster. Again, it's the conference in and of itself blends together industry with academia and government organizations, and then the academic part is both posters and presentations. So we will hear a little bit more about James' presentation in a minute. But please, James, why don't you start sharing a little bit about Apimondia?
Yeah, let me piggyback on that, Max. As you see here, this is a poster section, and this is like an accordion sort of row of panels, and there were over 600 posters at this, and they were displayed in two-day groups. So there's 300 approximately one 2 day segment and 300 the next. So there was just a tremendous amount of knowledge, dissemination and transfer and discussion through these poster sessions, and then during the talk sessions, there were many. There were three big conference rooms, and those were going in parallel. And then there was the expo, the trade show, which is a little bit different if you've been to other conferences. Usually, the trade show is just sort of people vending with their products. But at Apimondia, the expo is actually that plus countries or regions have their own booth that represents the beekeeping industry for their country. And so those are can be very elaborate and big or little tiny, but they have, again, they're presenting their country to the world, to the beekeepers that are attending, and those I always find fascinating to go visit those. And some of them are about kind of the cultural side of the beekeeping. Some of those are also big business. If you're, say, Argentina, which is a big honey exporter, then you're probably looking for, contracts or business or things like that. So the whole event kind of has this, as Max said, this combination of a lot of the scientific, but a lot of the cultural, how beekeeping is done in different parts of the world, and scientific talks, and then the new products, the up and coming business that wants to make a big splash on the international scene, and so you kind of see that there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of dynamics in the conference. And I'll say there was one kind of outstanding part of this conference, and it's interesting that we're talking about honey story and that sort of thing with with HiveTracks, but um, the emphasis and the amount of energy talking about honey itself at this conference, I thought was more than I'd seen
Mhm.
before. And I've been attending Apimondia since 2013 is when I started. Uh, the last one I went to was 2019 in Montreal. Max hit the last two in Turkey, which was relocated from Russia, and then Chile the last time. But yeah, so overall, I just wanted to give you the landscape of what Apimondia is like. And if you ever get the chance to go, it's an experience. Again, you walk around. There's all different languages, right? All different sort of uh, you know dress and just people. If you like people watching and in this case, all of them are beekeepers or bee lovers, bee researchers, which kind of have their own vibe, and we all know what that is, and you can pick them out. Actually, going to the conference on in the airport. I was telling my son, Oliver, I said, watch, I bet there's going to be some beekeepers. And sure enough, like in the line to get on the plane to Copenhagen, there was beekeepers and I could pick them out. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the honey piece to me was a big highlight, Max. And I'll talk more about that as we go. If you want to talk about some of your, yeah, kind of your highlights.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always like traveling the world in a room, right? I mean, you can already some of these pictures show, you got on the left you see Italian origin, on the right this is a company from Germany. So you would always again, Apimondia is held every 2 years. It's the largest. Apimondia is the International Federation of Beekeeping Associations, so it's kind of like the mother organization of all the beekeeping associations around the world. It has been held since the late 1890s. I think 1897 was the first one, and then it took place every 2 years. And it's a little bit like the international beekeeping family coming together. And as James was saying, it's really a nice mix between the different stands and the cultures. And you just by going through, you may have seen some on the socials. You get a taste of what beekeeping is like in different countries. Some of that is very international. Otherwise, it's very regional, so you get to taste honey. James will talk about the global honey bar here in a second, where every country brought their own honey to be tasting. And just in the picture that we see here, the middle one is Apime, that's from Turkey or from Turkey, and then Italy on the left, and then Germany on the right. So you can literally travel the world through by going, for just a few steps along the hall, and it's very interesting just because 2 years is sort of the right rhythm. And then with these 7,500 visitors that came, it's just a wonderful mix of people, wonderful mix of people who expose, or people who put their latest tech or some of the beekeeping equipment on display. And then these conferences are always also encapsulated with, or like are in brackets of technical tours. So usually you would have the local beekeeping organization that co-organizes the trip with Apimondia. And now, since it is in Copenhagen, it was done in conjunction with all the Scandinavian beekeeping organizations and associations. So primarily Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And for those who have looked at Copenhagen on a map, that is a very short either ferry or train ride over to Sweden. So some of the technical tours took place there. So there's lots of opportunity to really dive into what beekeeping feels and looks and smells like in different countries and for different regions. And this obviously, when you travel and you do these epimondia, there's always going to be like I would call it a regional bias, right? So it's like wherever it is, the surrounding countries will have the biggest percentage of people who go and visit. So there was a good amount of German, Swedish, Danish people in this case. And yeah, and most of it will be made available online. So, Anthony, I saw a question from you. Much of the content, both from the presentations, will be there's a booklet where all the abstracts will be published. So it's easy to reach out to the people publishing and like get in contact with researchers, policymakers, and companies that present their work on the topic.
Yes, and I did in answer to that as well. I did see from the Apimondia organization, they are going to, put these out there again, properly, citations and things where you can access the abstracts at least. The talks themselves, I don't think will be out there, but the documents, the abstracts that were submitted for that will be out there. And one comment on this slide right here on the right, you see this wolf in the hive. This was one of the IoT device sensors, that sort of thing, which HiveTracks has been kind of tracking along with those as complements to what we do with HiveTracks. You've seen I use Hive Scales in the past, and there was kind of a I don't know, there was a rebirth of new players in the space, which happens over time. It's, this isn't a particularly new idea, but there are new players who come up with new implementations, new ways of doing it using the latest technology. And so I saw a whole kind of new set of those there, and this was one in particular that caught my eye. And so all that to say that the IoT devices and sensors and things like that, that's still happening. I will say there was, kind of AI tacked onto a few different things um, throughout the trade show, but I don't think any of those were kind of in-depth uses of AI just yet. And so again, that's things that we're also playing with and using, but it's not having a huge impact, in my opinion, yet in the beekeeping space in a meaningful way, other than marketing. So, um, yeah, so back to the honey. Let's talk a little bit more about this. You can see on the right there, the global honey bar was this banner over this whole area that had literally hundreds of honey samples that you could sample, and so pretty much every break I would go over and go dip in through a few of them, trying to make my way around the whole thing. But here on the left, Slovenia, they're very culturally kind of the bees are part of them, part of their identity. And so these are some very nice samples that they had. The one in the middle, this was a very unusual one. If you're familiar with Apis dorsata, that's those big version of the honeybees that most of you probably seen these videos of if they're open air hives, and they have this mechanism where they all shift, and they have this wave that looks like it goes across the surface of the swarm or the hive. And anyway, that this was the honey from them, and it was very interesting. Actually, I liked it a lot. And then there were stingless honeybees, honey, which has some, different medicinal properties and things like that. I will say the U.S. had about six different varieties. One of those was sourwood from Virginia Webb, and I also shared my sourwood with Marina, who she's American Honey Tasting Society. She had a very strong presence there as well at the whole Apimondia She was moderating several of the panels, and so she tasted my sourwood and said it was very good. I was very happy with that seal of approval from her. But again, the honey was front and center. Not only did they have the honey bar, but every day there were this section called Global Honey Talks, and there were just talks about honey from all over the world, different aspects of it, and honey adulteration, honey fraud, tools for combating that. Again, that was a big theme. There were sections of talks specifically set aside for that.
Did you have? I personally like the eucalyptus honey quite a bit. James, do you have do you have a honey that like kind of stood out or something you hadn't tried before where you're like, huh, this is an interesting one?
Well, all of the stainless bee ones, they just have a I don't know, just a different sort of nature to them that's interesting. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and this is, I mean, again, it's like it's this is sort of the center of it, the entire Apimondia. So you would have all the scientific talks and the rooms on the left, and you would have all the Api Expo, which is where all the vendors are on the right, and then this global honey bar was literally in the middle. So it was one of
Yeah.
the areas that made it very easy. Um, yeah, and Joan already asks about, discussions on honey fraud. We will get to that here in just a
Yeah, for
second.
sure.
Maybe, a few words here about the people you met, James, and then I'm happy to share a little bit
Sure.
as well.
Yeah, so one of the big things about any beekeeping conference, or let's just say beekeepers in general, we get together fairly frequently, regularly. That's why we have beekeeping clubs and things, and we get together and we love to talk about bees. And so this is at a different scale, of course, at the global level. And just over the years, you develop friendships with those people, in your local organization or at the state level or at the national level. And a lot of times you don't see them except at these events. And so there were several folks that I haven't seen since really 2019 and Montreal. Um, and or The fellow in the middle is Peter Cosmas. He's from Slovenia, and he is the vice president of Apimondia. And Max and I got to know him in sort of our origin story of in Rome, Italy, in 2019. We met Peter, and so I've really enjoyed getting to know him. And then on the left there, that's Hugh Evans. To me, he's kind of the uh, the grandfather of Hive sensors and IoT technology, and we've been good friends with him. He works for Be Hero now, but he's quite the character, and we always enjoy talking to him. And then on the right, I don't know if you recognize Stu Anderson from Flowhive. Um, but he's also a friend. I met him in 2015 in South Korea. I was giving a talk about HiveTracks and record keeping right next to him. If you remember Flow Hive in the spring of 2015, that's when they first came out. So he was giving a talk in the fall of 2015 about Flow Hive, and I got to know him there. And so again, these are just a smattering of kind of our some of our old friends that we know, and then there were several new folks that we got to talk to. There was several again in the beekeeping technology space. There were some new folks, some new players that I got to talk to and meet that I expect will be around for years to come. And so it's always good to network with those people. And these some of these are friendships, some of these are business, and of course from HiveTracks perspective, we were there kind of for business development as well. And so we met, talked to folks about that and how we might collaborate. In fact, we've already got a collaboration with Kirsten Trainer we're thinking about in Germany with some of their hive monitoring or actually pollinator biodiversity monitoring tools that they're creating. Again, so that's always an outcome of one of these events. So, Max, how about you?
Yeah, I think this ties
Any,
into what Chris just asked in the chat. What did we learn? What were the key takeaways? And I think one of the core takeaways is how much is being focused outside the hive, which is very much in line with what we've been doing for the last few years of HiveTrack. So more and more people are understanding that, what happens around the hive biodiversity, the environment, the impact of the environment on a hive, and then of the hive on the environment. That is something that is just across across universities, research organizations. There's a lot more learnings coming through that. A lot of understanding, specifically in Europe. I mean, for the people who are tuning in from the US, it's a lot of very, very small countries in a very, very small space. So there's a lot of international collaboration going on, which is quite exciting to like understand how can there be like supranationals or across nations understanding, standardizing and datafying or data-driven best practices. So a lot of the research, Be the Net is one of the largest research projects that is coming to an end next year. It's all about understanding and standardizing both the data that is being used to help beekeepers better, and then what are the recommendations that can be given and what can be learned one country to the other. So really limiting the extent to the internet, the exposure, environmental exposure, and a lot of like lab testing has also become more widespread. Similarly, at what we're doing with HiveTracks to better understand what are the forever chemicals, what are the PFAS. I think one of the big learnings that I had there is that much of the even pesticides that were banned in the European Union in the 80s and 90s still show up under, certain thresholds in honey. And so that's very interesting to see that obviously bees are sensing much of what we did in the second half of the 20th century. So it's really like this recognition of a more fragile climate, a more, volatile climate, and more impact from the environment. How can we develop better and more resilient beekeeping practices around that? That is a big component. And then a lot of I saw work now is here from Ethiopia, for example, a lot also the shift towards looking at what are the countries doing that surround the European Union, for example, or countries that are not always necessarily, within the center of the attention here, but what is happening on the surroundings in combination with technology. So those were really for me the big learnings. And then if we move a little bit further here into 2027, it is the tradition during each of the Apimondia conferences. This is a little bit like a World Cup tournament to announce the Apimondia, the following Apimondia, and where it will take place. So in 2027, Apimondia will take place in Dubai. Right there in the middle, you can see this is the on the very right here, this is the Beekeeping Association of the UAE. This is Sahira. She is leading and running the Beekeeping Association, so she is in charge of managing and organizing it. We've been working with them for several years. The people you see in the picture here is from the Young Beekeepers Association. They had a meeting in Dubai, so they're basically working with a new generation of beekeepers, trying to get young people from all over the world excited and interested into beekeeping. So that's another one, seeing the new generation pick up beekeeping overall. So we're quite excited. As I mentioned, 7,500 visitors were registered for Apimondia in Copenhagen. In 2027, it will be the 50th anniversary, so the 50th Congress, Apimondia Congress, and they want to get to 15,000 visitors in 2027. So it's a big mark. It's a big number that they're trying to get to, but it will definitely be an exciting experience. So for them, they were saying, like as soon as after Apimondia is always before Apimondia, so they are starting to get ready. And then late in the closing ceremony, 2029 was announced, and 2029 Apimondia will take place in my home country, will take place in Germany, in a smaller town called Leipzig in the east of the country. So that will be quite exciting as well, knowing already when these will be. We don't know the dates yet for Apimendia 2027. It will likely be in November, December, which are the colder months, which will be easier because Dubai obviously has a very, very warm climate. But yeah, everybody is excited to get back, to build the relationships, and then meet again in 2027 for the next conference.
Yeah, Max, before you go on, let me go back to Krista. I had a couple of other kind of takeaways that in there's some areas that I'm not particularly focused on myself, but I every time I go to Apimondia, it's a pretty big element. And one of those is apitherapy. And I've heard kind of through some other channels, just there's some very interesting results that are beginning to be validated and are getting a lot of more traction than they have in the past. Sometimes the apitherapy has kind of been put in sort of alternative medicine, if you will. But there are definitely health benefits of propolis. And then bee venom is there's some very interesting work that's being done with bee venom for say Lyme's disease and some other things that show promise at least for bee venom. And so apitherapy again is a big component of there's multiple tracks and talks on apitherapy, and that's something that again is super interesting that this particular community, the Apimondia community, values and promotes a good bit. I also saw kind of as a subplot of the conference, there was more talk, I thought, this time about breeding for Varroa resistance. That's gotten more traction especially in the U.S., like with Corey Stevens and some of the work that he's doing. He was there. He had a poster. And then I also saw some of the YouTube kind of community. Cayman Reynolds was there. I saw him. So there it was interesting. I thought that some of that YouTube community was kind of at least was there, seeing what was going on, seeing what Apimondia was all about, which I think is a very good thing to get those kind of groups cross-pollinating in those places, which I haven't seen before, and so that was very good piece. But that Varroa resistance, talks and community and folks that really want to take that path towards Varroa control, Varroa management. And of course, AAA Labs was there, discussions about it. There was a workshop on it, a panel on that, and everybody's just kind of, you know, uh, doing what they can to anticipate that. And I know Auburn University in the U.S. has done a lot of work, kind of trying to make preparations and say, what are we going to do, to help mitigate it when it gets here. Because everybody's pretty convinced that it's eventually going to be here. So again, there was so much there. Y'all, I mean, I was talking to Max this morning. I was going back and reviewing the program, and there were so many things that I just didn't get to see. But it's a very comprehensive, pretty much anything that you're interested in, whether it's super deep scientific or more human based, economic development. There are a lot of projects in the global south and how to help, make beekeeping economically viable for folks to help, help them in their life, stage. So again, it's just a broad range of things that were, you know, available there to us.
And I would invite you. So we're gonna send out the link to the link to the mod, like the link to the entire program as well in this email. So feel free to take a look, peruse it. It's much easier if it's a PDF format, but you can see anything that touches upon beekeeping from very much trade related to apitherapy, as James was saying. It's quite incredible, and it's really you start to get really excited about these different topics. So, and all the names are in there, so you can dive a little bit deeper. Feel free to reach out and ask us any questions that may come up after this talk. And now moving over to give you a little glimpse of what it was like, of what these presentations were like. We're going to dive into James's presentation on honey authentication. I saw a post in the chat here about the Vermont honey, the Vermont honey beekeepers and how they're promoting Vermont honey, which is very conducive to what James is about to talk about. And again, in the trade related. So when we talk about honey and honey trade, honey authenticity has been a very, very big theme as long as there has been Apimondia. That is something specifically on the adulteration piece. And if you remember last webinar, we talked a lot about the honey story. So actually one of the the presentation that was selected as a presentation, you go through a review process for Apimondia. And our presentation that was selected was the honey authenticity, so the honey story presentation. So we'll give this a shortened version of it, but just to give you the highlights and for James to walk us through what he talked about on the big stage. Over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Max. And Yeah, I didn't put a picture of I put this on socials, but these conference rooms, this was a huge event center and their conference, the presentation rooms were massive. I mean, I don't know how many, you could have at least 500 people in that. It wasn't full, of course, but it was a big hall. Um, and so I gave this talk about Honey Story, and it's in a session with several other interesting talks I thought as well. And I'm not going to give this like as I would give the presentation, but I kind of will, but I'm going to intersperse some things that we learned along the way from others kind of in the honey authentication space, like some of the other talks um, that I went to that were talking about lab tests, and these are things we've talked about as well, but learned a little bit more about where the state of the art is in those things. Um, so anyway, we this was the title slide, and yeah, go ahead to the next one, Max. So again, the challenge is a global challenge, and it's also a local challenge. And maybe I've said this before, but I have the problem with people mislabeling sourwood honey, so this is personal to me. But I've also have friends in Canada who are trying to sell honey into markets that are the price is depressed because of cheap imports, and they're not able to, sell their honey for what it really is it should be worth for them to make a living, and they're undercut by honey that's either adulterated or it's mislabeled, things like that. And from my perspective, what can I do as a one as a beekeeper and two as a technology provider? Can we create or equip beekeepers with a tool that will help them in this challenge of how do you differentiate your honey from other honeys, create trust in a market that is mistrusted more and more. The more these stories get out about adulterated honey, then the consumers don't trust. And so, how can we build that trust? And the only way I know how to do that is kind of from a to create trust for me is a one-on-one. I'm at the farmer's market in this picture here is my farmer's market stand. And if any of you have sold honey before, you know what that's like. You talk to the customers, they develop a trust with you that you know what you're talking about, that your honey comes from this place. And so this original concept for the honey story was based in that, how do I export this kind of farmers market, person to person trust? How do I export that into the digital space or create a way in the digital space to duplicate that trust? And so that's where our honey story concept came from. And this is in stark contrast, I would say, to, wait a minute.
Dave has been carrying the cold all through Copenhagen.
And it makes me not able to talk sometimes. So anyway, here I made it. Okay. But this is in stark contrast to a lot of the efforts that were talked about at the conference. These are efforts at um, country level. There was a talk from the EU Commission, this honey platform form that they have created to deal with honey adulteration. And next year, they are requiring that honey labels have a percentage of where the honey comes from. And that's a great step. I mean, those are things that are needed, but those are things that are outside the beekeeper's control. The beekeeper can't, you know, create legislation that will help them, right? I mean, you can talk to your legislators, things like that, but what can a beekeeper do? And so our solution here, or part of the solution to the problem, is this honey story that gives you, the beekeeper, a mechanism for again differentiating, being part of the solution to creating trust that doesn't depend on these third party. So a government level regulatory policy or law, or even the lab tests. And the lab tests, there was a lot of talk about the lab tests and what are good lab tests, what are bad lab tests. The DNA tests, which in 2019 were kind of the up and coming, this is our solution to honey authentication. They've really cooled off on is that the solution? It's not the solution that they thought it was. It may still have some value, but there were talks about, these are the problems with any of these lab tests. You're going to have issues. They can't be the sole source of truth. In fact, even in our session, Max, there was the lady from Uruguay who their honey
Hmm.
naturally has a marker for adulteration in it. It has a something in their honey. They're not adulterating it, but on lab tests, it shows it as being adulterated. It sets off these alarms. So again, it was just a clear example of the lab tests are not the be all end all. It's part of the solution, just like we think Honey Story is part of the solution. And as you know, so the Honey Story, you use HiveTracks, you enter your data, and that validates that I was keeping bees at this place at this time. This is how many hives I had. This was the honey that I harvested. You can take pictures of the nectar sources. Again, so all of this data is validating that you created this honey, right? And it's the identity of the honey. You can, with the honey story, we create this QR code for you. You can put it on your honey, and it gives all this information about your honey. And so I think this link here was for the sourwood honey from this year from one of the locations. Uh, Next slide, Max, on this. To create the Honey Story in Pro, you just create this harvest profile for when you harvest your honey. And then that goes into your honey story. You get to create the content. You add the images, you add the text, you add the flavor profile for your honey. By the way, taste. Taste is a big important piece of this honey authentication, especially for sourwood. So if you ask Marina from the American Honey Tasting Society, clearly she's going to be very strong on it needs to have this taste profile for it to be what you say it is. And no matter and there's all sorts of things that you can do to mess up your honey as well. That was another several talks on harvesting your honey, processing the honey, how to keep it in good shape, the way the bees had it in the hive, and so that's important as well to the final product. But so in this HiveTracks Pro, you can create this honey story, put the QR code on there, and again, this gives you the beekeeper a way to differentiate your honey from any other honey in the market. So this is the obligatory, good technical kind of cool stuff that's going on, and we do have an implementation where you can add this layer of validation, this layer of security, if you will, this layer of trust to the data for your hive, for your honey. And without going into the technical details, the concept is essentially that once the records are validated this way, they can't be changed, they can't be altered, and so there's no way to be monkeying with the records, if you will, if they're validated this way. And I'll say in the same section where I gave my talk, there was a talk at the end on blockchain authentication, but it was traceability from this big company Intertech in Germany, and they essentially pick up from the beekeeper into the supply chain, and they have a blockchain implementation of that kind of chain of custody and flow of the data through the supply chain with blockchain authentication. And so that kind of in combination with what we're doing, there's a clear kind of we have the origin story for the honey, and then you can feed that into a blockchain implementation. Though that the big traceability solutions, that's out of the scope of what HiveTracks is capable of. Little HiveTracks, when you've got a big Intertech that has lots of resources, as they should, and traceability in a supply chain is not a new problem. It's not unique to um, to honey. There are a lot of kind of supply chain traceability things that are out there. So that solution I think will mature. Uh, but what we're talking about is kind of our beginning piece. And so we have this additional layer of authentication here as well. All right, Max. And we'll go pretty quickly here. We have, in addition to the data that you supply, there's a lot of third-party data that we want to layer in. And again, just layer on layer on layer of data will just provide more trust, more validation that the honey that you produce is what you say it is. Okay. And so that's the point of that slide there. All right, Max. And kind of final slide, really. This the way that most of you out there would use a honey story would be for your own sort of personal, if you're a small honey producer, if you're giving it to friends, or if you're a small producer and selling it, or you're providing it for, say, a wedding. So you want kind of a honey story specific to that wedding, or to your friends for Christmas. But there are several other really fascinating applications of it, of the honey story. And it could be for, say, a honey co-op, say in Ethiopia, they've got a honey co-op where they want to sell honey and export it. Then all the beekeepers there could participate in the honey story, and give them a branding, a way of telling the origin story of their honey that would give it a more market value out there. So again, there's these other applications that are kind of scale up with the honey story that we think are very useful, again, in different applications around the world. All right. So there you go. This is the, kind of the final, what it would look like on sourwood honey. You have your QR code, again, empowering you as a beekeeper, giving you a tool to say, this is my honey, this is what I say it is, and able to give a lot more information through the QR code than you can just put on the label. All right.
Yeah,
All right. I
and
think
this
that, yeah. So
you
that
did
that's
it,
that's
James.
that was sort of the talk. It was again, really focused on more presentation mode, but I hope you get the sense that there were other things happening in the universe that kind of complemented what we were doing, feeding into it, and yeah, there's a lot of moving parts and people working in different spaces with, how do we authenticate honey? How do we prevent fraud? Um, oh, there was one other kind of fascinating piece, that the honey adulteration is getting so sophisticated that they are creating such clean syrups to mix with it that lab tests are not going to be able to catch the adulteration. So again, it's an arms race with the fraudulent actors, um, and you're never going to get rid of all of it, but the goal is to make it too hard for them to to do what they do economically, and I think this is a piece of that
And
puzzle.
three things on that actually. And it's very nice. Marco had a good question in the chat here. So first off, what you see here, the honey stories, we actually spent a lot of time on honey stories over the last month. So we've done the really nice facelift that the honey stories have gotten. So they look the way you see them on the screen here are this the very same layout that you can get if you try to build or if you build a honey story in HiveTracks Pro. So we're getting more and more by the day. There's more people setting them up, which is really interesting. And then two, what was also really interesting when we talked to a company like Intertech, and again, Intertech, whole different level, they're involved in honey trade. But they start where we end, right? So it was very, very fascinating to see their interest in something that would close the first mile, if you will, of traceability to understand like the origin story of how it starts. And then with Marco, with what you said, this is exactly um, it's like the bottom-up approach, right? So we basically, and this is kind of the origin story of how James and I first started to work together, is like, can we flip authenticity and traceability on its head rather by creating an identity around the honey? And, at the end of the day, as beekeepers going through the season and recording the different steps, that creates an identity of knowing exactly where the honey was, what happened to the honey, the origin story of it. So it's very interesting to see that obviously the more complex supply chains get, some of the origin story of honey gets lost. But that's what we're trying to recreate here, to flip it on its head and say, no, there can't be this one single test that you do at one time that says, thumbs up or thumbs down, and everybody agrees upon it. So what we're trying to deliver with the honey story, what we're building toward is to have a framework that serves as a cobweb within which different layers can tune in to say at the end of the day, a hive is something that represents the relationship between a human being and nature over time and throughout the season. And that is something that, HiveTracks helps people to capture. And we've always wanted to find this way as James was saying, what is the digital bridge? What is the outlay to make it easier for people to follow that, right? What's the summary, be that in a taste note or in an origin story that makes it easy for people and for consumers to look into where honey comes from. And overall, from a trend perspective, I think this is something we've been seeing over the last maybe 50 years in wine, but 20 years in particular in areas like chocolate or coffee, where people are a little bit more mindful around, okay, where does it actually come from? Can I look for what in the industry is called single origin, right? Ideally, you want to look for when you buy olive oil or coffee or chocolate or honey, that it comes from one origin, that you know sort of where it comes from. And that is where the honey story taps in. And it's gotten a lot of interest, really. And that's quite fascinating. So we're excited to work with these larger companies that have a much more of a supply chain and traceability approach to say, okay, but let's not forget about the beekeeper, right? Let's not forget about the labor of love and the work that is required. And let's equip people with a means to tell that story digitally.
Yeah, and Anthony, further on your question, there are sort of standard profiles. Say for sourwood, it has this anise, caramel, buttery smooth. Again, there's these kind of ways of describing it, and it. I would say those are good, but they're also kind of categorized, putting it into a box, right? It might and so even within the sourwood, you're going to have some nuance. Again, depends on how deep you want to dive in that with any kind of tasting, you can get kind of infinitely, nuanced depending on how deep you want to go. But again, yeah, there are kind of broad categories that you can begin to put the honeys into, and that's kind of how I do it just at the farmers market. It's, this is a spring honey. It's mostly tulip poplar. It's got this, molasses note at the end. It's a very rich, deep flavor. Again, I'm not defining the honey. I'm just giving some characteristics, but this is my honey from my spring at my place. That's what it is, and so that's what you're selling, a specific, version of honey, and all of them are unique. That's where, you can't really funnel them into a box because each one is unique. And so that's really what we're after, is that recognize and educate that, it is unique.
Mhm. Thanks a lot, James. Yeah, for anybody wanting to scan the QR code, feel free to do it to see sort of like what the version looks like on your web. We are also coming toward the end, so make sure if you do want to take a look and enjoy 40% off of HiveTracks Pro to create your own honey story. Now in the Northern Hemisphere, we're coming off of the season, and it's starting to be a lot more time maybe in front of the fireplace and with time to be spending and creating the honey story, the Christmas gift. We'll be talking a lot more about that over the next month. If you take the code again, SEP40, you get to enjoy a 40% discount on it. And as mentioned prior, we will obviously take the recording and send it out to everybody next week for the people who couldn't join, or if you have any questions in the aftermath or you want to reach out about something in particular. I'm looking at the chat. We got 2 more minutes. Any final questions, thoughts, anything about Apimondia, Copenhagen, anything in addition that is
Well,
coming up?
yeah, I will add. I mean, while we're waiting on somebody, I was able to. Max, you talked about the technical tours. I actually stayed with a family. One of the beekeepers connected me with a family in Copenhagen that my family went with me. Got to stay there, and she had the mom wife in the group had a Warray hive in her yard. She had just one hive. I'd never looked at a Warray hive in my life. and we got to go into her hive and inspect it, which was great, and it was very fun. And they have buckfast bees are mostly what they have there, and so that was a highlight of my time there. Was able to actually got to do a little bit of beekeeping with a Warray hive, which was a new thing. So, and I will say Copenhagen is a really nice place to visit. I highly recommend it. Lots of interesting history and just culturally and socially, it's a really cool place to hang out and spend some time.
Well, those are fantastic closing words. I would say we're almost at the top of the hour, wanting to be mindful and respectful of everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining. It's almost
Yep.
midnight in Perth now, now, so I think the last it must be almost midnight in Ethiopia. So there are lots of people chiming in. Have a great rest of your day and a wonderful week ahead. Thank you again for making the time, and we will be in touch next week with the recording. Thank you, everybody, and
Great to
hope you
see
enjoyed
you.
it.